Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Ben, this is Books with Bengus Khan. The channel just hit 1K subs, which is gobsmacking to me. Thank you all for stopping by and for supporting the channel. And today I have for you my 2022 Year in Reading Review with a lot of reading stats. So I'm a little off-center today because I'll put up a lot of graphs over here. I'll go over genres and subgenres I read, a breakdown of authors in various ways, and I'll finish up by talking about my favorite new authors and series that I discovered this year, along with the biggest surprise of the year. So let's start with the number of books that I read. Here are all the numbers of books I've read in the last bunch of years. This year I got to 100, which is a nice, fun, round number. So editing Ben here from the future, I forgot my star ratings for all 100 books. It was a wildly successful year, with 42% coming in at 5 stars and 35% at 4 stars. So 77% were books that I was basically fully invested in, totally engaged from start to finish, or nearly so. And that's when I'm very happy, when they're in that 4 to 5 star range. And unfortunately, I had a few 1-star reads, and there were some big books that I really slogged all the way through. I want to be better at just recognizing when I'm having those types of experiences and putting those down sooner and DNFing more, because I did not DNF a single book in this year. But overall, very happy with how I'm choosing books. A lot of this is because I'm reading authors that I already know I love, or continuing series, but a lot of new releases, new authors too, and just getting those from the booktube community, from authors who are very prominent in their particular genres and subgenres, and I just want to keep on discovering lots of new great reads, and I'm hopeful that this high batting average can continue. And if we look at the pages read, which is a more accurate measure of how much I've been reading, you'll see that I read about 42,000 pages, which is about a third as more as I read last year, which had been my biggest ever reading year up to that point. And so I read the most I've ever read in my life. It was a fantastic reading year. As you see here, after I graduated college in 2011, I was doing a lot of reading. Didn't have to do so much reading for classes, and I was having a good time, and I was teaching abroad, and I had lots of free time. But then from 2014 to 2016, I started reading a lot less, and I hadn't yet rediscovered fantasy, and so I was just reading literary fiction, and I just wasn't too into it until I discovered my love for modern sci-fi and fantasy, and it's been a steady increase over these last few years, and I just want to keep that train rolling going into 2023. All right, now out of those 100 books that I read, let's break it down by main genre. So here's the breakdown, and as you see, it's dominated by fantasy at well over half of all the books I read. We have historical fiction and sci-fi taking up chunks there. I tend to really enjoy sci-fi, and I have a lot of sci-fi authors I want to try, so going forward, I want that sci-fi percentage to start increasing and cutting into the fantasy. And this is the first year I discovered historical fiction, so yeah, if we would have taken this pie chart from last year, it would have been almost 100% fantasy. So I've been diversifying my reads, and I want to continue to do that. Now I want to break it down by subgenre. So epic fantasy is by far in the lead at 32%. Historical fiction again. Then we have a lot of urban fantasy, progression fantasy for the first time ever. I tried the Cradle series, and some pieces like sci fantasy, which would be the Sun Eater series, sci-fi, a little bit of nonfiction, historical fantasy, and my first ever manga that I tried, which is the first couple volumes of Berserk. I want to keep going in that. And then to see if things are affected by page count, here's the subgenres by number of pages. And epic fantasy increased a bit, so a lot of those epic fantasies are longer than average. And urban fantasy ended up overtaking historical fiction, so a lot of those historical fiction sharp books I read by Bernard Cornwell were pretty short. So yeah, on terms of page count, this was my subgenre breakdown. I want to diversify my reading more than I have been and start rotating more into the different subgenres, so making sure that I hit urban fantasy and epic fantasy and historical fiction and sci-fi, and just being a little bit more intentional about rotating among all these. All right, now my breakdown between traditionally published books and self-published books. Here it is. So it's dominated by TradPub at 88%, but this was more self-pub than I'd ever read before, so I read all the Cradle self-pub books and Legends and Lattes when it first came out as self-pub, and I really enjoyed a lot of these books, but so many of what I buy is either from Barnes& Noble or Book Outlet online discounted or in used bookstores. So I have so many TradPub books on my shelves ready to go that I don't really think I'm going to be able to read that much self-pub in the next bunch of years. But if I ever switch more to reading on Kindle, which I haven't really been doing, then I assume I'll want to read more self-pub. But yeah, TradPub is not anything sacred to me. Tor has really been disappointing me with some newer authors that I've tried, like Brian Staveley and R.R. Virdi. And so I really want to do at least some self-pub very intentionally going forward to make sure I'm spreading the love to authors who might not have hit that jackpot with their agent or with a certain publisher picking them up. Now here's a breakdown of the books I read by author gender. So it is 98% male, 2% female. And so I read 2 books this year by female authors. That was Babel and the first Wizard of Earthsea book by Ursula K. Le Guin. And I have so many books and series that I am excited to dive into by female authors. And I just have not been picking them up, and so I am going to make a concerted effort to do that. Whether it's the rest of Robin Hobb's books that I haven't read, Jen Williams, Fonda Lee, Martha Wells, Jacqueline Carey. The list goes on and on for me of books that I'm excited to try by female authors, and this is a situation that has to improve. And I was kind of curious, at least, if there was more of a balance in terms of the gender of the protagonists in the books I was reading, and there is. So if I look at the gender of the protagonist, so 75% of my books had a single male protagonist, and 10% had a female protagonist. And then about 15% had a mix of male and female protagonists. So I still want to definitely shift this more towards female protagonists, and I want to be very intentional about that going forward. Now here's a breakdown of my first reads versus rereads on the year. So 20% were rereads, with 80 being first reads. Now this is probably similar to previous years for me, but with so many books that I want to try by new authors and new series, at least for the next year, really want to shift to almost all newer reads. I had a fun time rereading the Dresden Files this year, and it had been a little while since I've read a lot of those, but there's no great need for me to do rereads when I'm so excited to try new authors, so I really want to dive in to more new authors. Speaking of new authors, here's a breakdown of my reads by new versus familiar authors. So 63% were new, and then 37% familiar. And like I said, I want this in the near future to skew heavily towards newer authors. I have so many I'm excited to try on my shelves. And I only read 27 authors this year total, because I read so many series. And so I only tried 17 new authors. This upcoming year, I want that number to go much higher. Something I wanted to do more of this year than I'd ever done was read new releases. And not just in series I was already reading, but debut books or new book ones. And I did succeed in that partially. I still have a bunch of new releases that I have not gotten to. But 16% of my reads were new releases, with 84% being backlist. I'm fairly proud of that number when it was closer to 0% new releases the last couple years, as I've tried to hit a lot of the famous series and authors in the genre since I came back to it as an adult. But I want to keep going with new releases and supporting book ones, debut authors. I know it's so important for them to get that initial support. And I had great luck with it. Daughter of Red Winter, Mickey 7, Ogres, Babel, Dead Man's Hand, Justice of Kings. A lot of fantastic new releases for me this year. Maybe only one miss, the first binding, but overall I was very happy with the new releases. Now here's a fun one, because as mostly a fantasy reader, you would expect this one to be heavily skewed, and it is. This is a chart of my reads based on if they are part of a series or if they're standalones. So only 4% of my books were standalones, with about 96% being part of a series. And this was just for the fiction books that I read. And so almost all of them were part of a series. Some of them were book ones that I didn't even know if they were going to be part of a series, like Mickey 7, but it is going to be. Legends and Lattes is going to be. And so yeah, very few standalones. I want to do something to make sure I hit standalones, because I have a lot on the shelf, but I tend to just get caught up in series and want to go for those long series. And so I want to do things like Jake Bishop has done, where he sets aside a whole month to be a month of standalones and can just knock out a whole bunch. And that way you get to new authors, different worlds. So I want to make sure I up my standalone reading for sure. Now, here is a breakdown of my most read authors by number of book. That is dominated by Bernard Cornwell at 18. So that's a lot of the Sharp series. I think I read 15 out of 23. And then the Warlord Chronicles. So loved diving into Cornwell for the first time this year. And then Jim Butcher at 16, since I did a reread of most of the Dresden Files books, and he also had his novella come out, The Law. So those are shorter, and those were a breeze kind of by audio that I did. And then Tchaikovsky, Adrian Tchaikovsky with 8. I did the second half of the Shadows of the App series at the beginning of this year, as well as Ogres, great new release, and a Shadows of the App story collection. And then Brandon Sanderson with 8. So that's the last 2 Wheel of Time books that I finished up at the start of the year, as well as rereads of Mistborn Era 2, the new release Lost Metal, and a reread of a couple of his novellas like Emperor's Soul and Mistborn Secret History. And then new authors like James S.A. Corey with 6 with the Expanse books, and Christopher Rocchio with 6 Sun Eater books. I actually just finished Ashes of Man and loved it. So yeah, Sun Eater is going great. Now in terms of a series wrap-up, I finished The Wheel of Time, Shadows of the Apt, Mistborn Era 2, Novels of the Malazan Empire, and the Warlord Chronicles. Most of those are some of my favorite series now of all time. Maybe not Novels of the Malazan Empire so much, and Mistborn Era 2 is just pretty good. But it was a great year for finishing up series. And for discovering new series and authors, I discovered a new absolute favorite, which is Christopher Rocchio and the Sun Eater saga, and a new favorite author in Bernard Cornwell with the Sharp books and the Warlord Chronicles, just getting me into a whole new genre of historical fiction that I can't wait to explore more with his other series, but also lots of other authors and places and time periods as well. So really excited about discovering that. In terms of other new authors, I discovered David Gemmell with the first couple Draenei books, and I'm excited to try basically everything else he's ever written. Then George R. R. Martin with A Game of Thrones. That was the first time I read it, and I loved it more than I was expecting to. Can't wait to read the rest of his writing. Ursula K. Le Guin with the first Earthsea book was fantastic. Can't wait to read the rest of Earthsea and all of her sci-fi. I discovered Travis Baldree, both as an author with Legends and Lattes, which is delightful, and as a narrator of the Cradle series. And so, great discovery all around of Travis Baldree. Other new authors that I really loved, James S.A. Corey, Ed McDonald, Richard Swan, Edward Ashton, and James J. Butcher. So love discovering lots of new authors that I'm going to be following their whole careers as they release new books in their series. Can't wait to get a hold of those. Now, some authors that weren't new, but that just continued being great for me would be Adrian Tchaikovsky, just keeping the great Shadows of the App series rolling along, and Ogres, just one of my favorite books of all time, great little novella. Brandon Sanderson kept things going for me with The Lost Metal, and the great, fantastic finish to The Wheel of Time. Stephen Erickson did not disappoint when I read The God Is Not Willing, and Jim Butcher was a joy to revisit through the Dresden Files. That series is great for rereads. Now for my single biggest surprise of the year, that is, drumroll please, Babel by R.F. Kuang. I did not really enjoy reading books 2 and 3 of the Poppy War series, so I was not going into this with very high expectations, but it was the kind of it fantasy book of the year. I wanted to be part of the conversation, and her writing intrigued me enough where I wanted to try something new, and I got completely immersed, caught up in the story. It is not the most refined piece of literature that's ever been written, but it was perfect for me in terms of getting me invested in these stories, in the real-world themes being very thought-provoking. So, just fantastic book, and I eagerly await her future published works. So that is my 2022 year in review. I hope you enjoyed seeing all the statistics and the breakdowns, and yeah, happy reading in 2023!